Fellas, we're going to be taking a look at some fighters in the UFC who've been fast-tracked way too quickly in the UFC. So a fighter that joined the UFC, got given a couple of cans that they beat, and then got a massive and monumental step up in competition against somebody completely out of their league, against someone completely undeserving, and someone they had no business being in there with. So we're going to be looking at some fighters who got fast-tracked in the UFC, and also what they should have done instead. The alternative approach to help them have a steady start to their UFC career and potentially build them up to be a good prospect or even a legit contender rather than getting fast-tracked. So the first example of this list is Ikram Aliskerov, someone who is well known for kind of getting fast-tracked early this year. But before we look at the fast-tracking, let's look at why the UFC was so fond of this guy in the first place. You look at his career before the UFC, he was getting a lot of finishes on some decent promotions. He was a good prospect, was Ikram Aliskerov, a good local guy, and his only loss was to Khamzat Chimaev, who obviously, as we know, is a legitimate contender in the middleweight division, a guy with a lot of potential, a guy with a lot of momentum. So his only loss was to Chimaev, which isn't anything to be ashamed of. He joined the UFC in the Contender Series, got a finish, then he knocked out Chinny Phil Halls, and he got matched up against Wally Alves. Wally Alves stepped in on short notice, and he ended up finishing him too. And at this moment in time, Ikram Aliskerov was a really good prospect, one of the best prospects in the UFC. Some people said he was the best unranked middleweight in the world. Some people were saying he was going to be unbeatable. He was a future champion. He was never going to lose in the UFC. He had all sorts of hype to his name, and that was until the Whittaker-Chimaev situation. Obviously, Whittaker was booked against Chimaev for UFC Saudi Arabia. Khamzat Chimaev ends up pulling out due to a sickness, and then Ikram Aliskerov steps in on short notice, which was a massive step up. I understand he was trying to save UFC Saudi Arabia, and, you know, it was a big high-risk, high-reward fight for him. But to go from Wally Alves, I don't care how good you looked against Wally Alves, to go from Wally Alves to Robert Whittaker is night and day. Whittaker's one of the greatest middleweights of all time, and you've got to him by beating Wally Alves, and it showed in the fight because he got absolutely chinned. Whittaker went out there, completely chinned Ikram Aliskerov, completely destroyed him in that first round, and showed that they are levels apart in skill. And that's what happens when a guy with hype gets put in there with someone who's already displayed that they're one of the greatest. Like I said, Whittaker's a top 3 greatest middleweight of all time. Ikram Aliskerov had a couple good wins in the UFC against cans and was able to get a fight with Robert Whittaker. Now, what he should have done instead is he should have taken that fight against Antonio Tricoli. He was booked against Antonio Tricoli, I think, a week before UFC Saudi Arabia or 2 weeks before. He should have taken that fight, and he should have, you know, it was a free win for Ikram Aliskerov to develop his experience in the UFC, and I still think at this point he didn't deserve a ranked fighter. He should have fought one of the better unranked fighters in the UFC, like a Roman Kopylov, an Andre Muniz, a Paul Craig, somebody like that to give him the experience. And if you can beat one of those guys, then give him a ranked fighter. Give him somebody like Chris Curtis or Jack Hermansson or Roman Dolidze, somebody in the top 15 to top 10 range, to give him that more experience against a ranked fighter and to help build his name and build himself up. That's what I think Ikram Aliskerov should have done, because like I said, he's got a lot of potential, and he still does have a lot of potential, to be fair, but he didn't have to suffer that loss to Robert Whittaker. I understand he was trying to save the show, and it was a massive opportunity for him. If he would have won that fight, it would have been massive things for him, but it was a huge step up in competition. To go from Wally Alves to Robert Whittaker is night and day. So Ikram Aliskerov's the first example of a fighter that got fast-tracked way too quickly. Another popular example is Darren Till. One of the more popular examples on this list of somebody who got fast-tracked. Started off his UFC career, got 3 wins and a draw to Nicolas Dalby, and he was a good prospect in the UFC. He had a lot of charisma as well. People were hyped as, you know, both of him as a fighter and his personality. Got the fight booked against Cowboy, ended up finishing Cowboy, which was a really good win for Darren Till. And then he gets booked against Stephen Thompson in Liverpool, gets a razor-thin controversial decision win over Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and like I said, it was in Liverpool, which doesn't make things better for Darren Till. And then immediately after that, he gets a title shot against Tyron Woodley. Not just a ranked fighter, but he gets a title shot when his best wins are a finish over Cowboy Cerrone and a razor-thin decision win over Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. And already in his UFC career, he's fighting for a belt, which was a massive fast track for Darren Till. He didn't really have any business being in there with Tyron Woodley as well, of all people. And it showed in the fight because he got completely obliterated. Woodley destroyed him both on the feet and in the grappling exchanges, to the point where he even submitted Darren Till. And it was one of Darren Till's worst performances to this day, and he's had some bad performances. He looked completely horrible in that fight, and it affected him for the rest of his UFC career. And the thing that made him worse is the fact that he couldn't even land a single significant strike in that fight. To not only lose, but to not be able to land a single significant strike just shows how badly he got dominated. And he ended up losing his next 4 out of his next 5 fights in the UFC, which kind of just shows the effect that this fight had on Darren Till. Now, what he should have done instead is, listen, I'm not going to blame him for taking a title fight. If there's an opportunity on the table to fight for a belt, you're going to take it. People work their entire life to get a title shot. shot. So if you've basically got one for free by the UFC, you're going to take the title shot. Why wouldn't you? But I think before or after his win over Wonderboy Thompson, he should have got more experience. He's a new prospect in the UFC. He's a young guy. Give him somebody like Damian Maia or Rafael dos Anjos or Robbie Lawler, a top welterweight that you can actually, improve your skill on, get you that experience. Because then if he would have beaten one of those guys and then faced Woodley or fought for the belt, he would have been a much more improved fighter, much more experienced fighter, much more skilled fighter, and he would have had a much better opportunity and looked much better. So that's what I think Darren Till should have done, because like I said, it had a massive effect on his next couple of fights, because he ended up losing 4 out of his next 5, and he's not even in the UFC anymore. And he was once a really intriguing prospect in the UFC, somebody who had a lot of potential, an undefeated guy, and ended up being the guy who had a massive what if attached to his name because he got fast-tracked way too quickly. So Darren Till is another example of a fighter who got fast-tracked way too quickly. Then we've got Benoit Saint-Denis. Now, I thought it'd be fitting to include Benoit Saint-Denis, considering he's going to be fighting this weekend at UFC Paris. Yeah, Benoit Saint-Denis, unlike anyone else in this list, I do think he deserved to fight a ranked opponent, because he'd had 5 straight wins in the UFC. He had a ton of hype to his name. He was an absolute killer, a mix of knockouts and submissions over some pretty good fighters as well, like Moises, and knocking out Matt Frivola at UFC 295. He had a ton of potential to his name, did Benoit Saint-Denis, and I think he deserved to be in the position he was. So I think a ranked fighter was the good move next for Benoit Saint-Denis, and I think he was ranked as well at 13th at the time of facing Dustin Poirier. But like I said, getting a top 5 fight, I think to get a top 5 fight in the lightweight division, you've really got to earn it by beating a couple of ranked guys. To go from Matt Frivola to Dustin Poirier, who was ranked number 3 at the time, is a massive step up in competition for Benoit Saint-Denis. This is Dustin Poirier, arguably the greatest fighter in UFC history to never win a belt. A guy who has faced so many different styles, so many different killers, so many different top fighters, and in completely different generations as well. This is the guy that you're facing. And he got chinned in that fight as well. He didn't look too bad in the first round, but after that first round, he ended up getting dropped, outboxed, chinned, and he just got completely dominated until he got brutally finished by Dustin Poirier. Blame it on staph infection or whatever you want. Dustin Poirier went out there and did the job and completely just displaced Benoit Saint-Denis. Now, what he should have done is, listen, like I said, I think he should have got a ranked fight. I think at this point he would have deserved a ranked fight. Just not anyone in the top 5. Somebody like Dan Hooker, Renato Moicano, Jalin Turner would have been the perfect move to, give Benoit Saint-Denis a ranked fighter and kind of to test how good he's in the lightweight division. Or even if you want to go far, give him somebody like Benil Dariush or Mateus Gamrot. Just someone in the lightweight division that we can really test the skill of Benoit Saint-Denis against. Not Dustin Poirier. And again, we need to see how he looks this weekend against Renato Moicano, because this is his second toughest test in his UFC career outside of obviously the fraud check-in to Dustin Poirier. But I think Benoit Saint-Denis was fast-tracked too quickly. He had a good promising start to his UFC career, and he still does have potential, to be fair. It's not completely over, but to go from Matt Frivola to Dustin Poirier without having to beat a single ranked lightweight is a crazy jump in competition. So Benoit Saint-Denis is another example. Then we've got Shamil Gaziev, a guy who is kind of mocked for being fast-tracked way too quickly and for his physique. But obviously joined the UFC, finished Martin Badai, which was a good win, to be fair, because Martin Badai is one of the better unranked heavyweights out there. Finished and completely battered Martin Badai, and in his second fight in his UFC career, he was in a main event opportunity, not just fighting on the prelims or on the main card, he was in a main event opportunity against Rosenstrike for a fight night in his second fight against, like I said, a ranked fighter in Rosenstrike in his second fight. This is a massive step up for Shamil Gaziev, and I don't really know how he'd earn this, and it showed in the fight because Rosenstrike was boxing the head off him. He was getting completely outstruck to the point where he literally had to quit in the middle of the fight because he couldn't take it anymore. He was in no condition to fight for a main event opportunity. Now, what he should have done instead is just taken the noble approach. Fight any other unranked heavyweight out there. Face a Waldo Cortez Acosta. Face a Robelis Despain. Face a Mick Parkin. Just face any other unranked heavyweight out there. First of all, to condition your stamina, because your stamina is terrible. And just to give you that UFC experience. He's in his last fight booked against Dontel Mayes. That should have been the move after Martin Badai, rather than putting him straight in the deep end against Rosenstrike. Dontel Mayes should have been the fight to give him after Martin Badai, rather than giving him, obviously, Rosenstrike immediately in a main event opportunity as well. I don't know how he'd earned that in his second fight as well. So for Shamil Gaziev, even though he does have some potential to be a ranked heavyweight, I think the approach that the UFC gave him was way too quick. Beat Martin Badai in his ranked fight for a fight night main event. Massive step up in competition for Shamil Gaziev, and I think he did get fast-tracked way too quickly, and that's quite frankly why he's been mocked so badly. Then we've got Nursultan Ruziboyev, again, another big prospect in the UFC, who the UFC obviously fought too fondly of and given an opponent way too quickly. Now, he started off his UFC career going 2-0 with 2 knockouts in the first round. Obviously, knocked out Bruno Ferreira, which is a really good win because Bruno Ferreira nowadays is known for being one of the best knockout artists in the middleweight division. And he beat Cedric Damas as well. So we started off his UFC career with a bang, had a ton of hype to his name, and then he got a fight with Buckley at UFC St. Louis, a ranked fighter Buckley, who, bearing in mind, was on a 3-fight winning streak and had wins over ranked fighters like Vicente Luque at the time of this fight being booked. And I know Buckley said he'd fight anyone at UFC St. Louis. He said he doesn't care who he fights, he will fight anyone to get on that St. Louis card. And the UFC obviously took advantage of that by putting him against Ruziboyev, one of the most dangerous prospects at the time. But the UFC obviously thought that Ruziboyev was going to perform a lot better than he did, because he ended up getting not battered, but he kind of got dominated in that fight. Buckley looked much better in there, nearly finished him, was completely out wrestling him in there, and he kind of just showed that there are levels to this and you haven't built yourself up. Buckley went out there, looked more dominant, and got the win by decision after a pretty dominant performance to Buckley. Now, what Ruziboyev should have done instead, in my opinion, is, like I said, he started off his UFC career with a bang, and he should have kept that up. In his next couple of fights, he should have faced somebody like Santiago Ponzinibbio or Nicolas Dalby. I'm not saying this is the exact route he should have taken, but this is an example. Beat somebody like Ponzinibbio, and then Nicolas Dalby, then get your fight opportunity against a ranked fighter. You know, he got fast-tracked way too quickly. He's still got a lot of potential, does Ruziboyev, but to go from Cedric Damas to Joaquin Buckley, who was on a 3-fight winning streak, is a big step up in competition for Ruziboyev as well. So I think Ruziboyev got fast-tracked too quickly. A ton of potential, massive welterweight, very dangerous, but he got a big step up in competition way too quickly. The next example is Abbas Magomedov, the Nico Bellic of the UFC. This guy has one of the more viral and arguably the worst fast-trackings in the UFC. Even outside the UFC, it wasn't like he was on an absolute banger. He had a couple of good wins in some decent promotions, but he wasn't coming into the UFC with a ton of hype. He has one win in the UFC against Dustin Stoltzfus by knockout in the first round, and then in his second fight gets a main event opportunity against Sean Strickland, the same Sean Strickland that in his next fight went on to win the middleweight belt and become one of the biggest stars in the UFC history. That was not in UFC history, but in the UFC at the time. That Sean Strickland is who Magomedov ended up facing in a fight night main event in his next fight. Go from Dustin Stoltzfus to Sean Strickland is a massive step up as well. Dustin Stoltzfus isn't even UFC worthy. The dude is barely UFC material. To go from him to a fight night main event opportunity against Sean Strickland is crazy. And Strickland went out there and battered him, to be fair. Completely outboxed him. Ended up getting the finish as well. Sean Strickland, this guy's known for being a decision machine. Ends up finishing Magomedov. And yeah, Magomedov just got fast-tracked way too quickly. Now, what he should have done is, just like everyone else, build himself up, face somebody like GM3, who was originally booked against, Andre Petroski, Armen Petrosian, just any unranked middleweight who's going to test Abbas Magomedov and getting that experience he needs. So to go from that to Sean Strickland is a crazy step up in competition, and arguably one of the worst ones on this list. But those are some fighters who got fast-tracked in the UFC, got a big step up in competition way too quickly. Let me know your thoughts on this list, if there are any fighters you could have added to this list. But yeah, like I said, let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.